again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. My name is Mars, and today we are going to talk about what I consider to be the 5 best trials in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. Now, this is a video that I'm making because I want to highlight, some of the things that I think are really awesome about some of the trials that we've received in the game, and hopefully it's received as feedback so that when we get additional trials in the future, or we get some global exclusive content, they can be melded with some of these features in mind. And so I've just picked 5 of them that really stand out in my mind as my top 5 favorites. There are obviously many other trials aside from these that I like, but each of these trials featured something that I really strongly felt was awesome about the trial. And for me, made them a memorable experience, made them a lot of fun to take on. And they do come from all different eras of the game. Some of them are earlier fights, some of them are much later. And yeah, we're just going to start from the bottom. Number 5. My number 5 pick is actually Alexander 3 stars. And I know a lot of people have a lot of frustration with this fight because it is quite challenging. And his flag mechanic is interesting, and a lot of people may not understand what's going on or the turn rotation or whatever. But when you understand the fundamentals of the fight and handling the flag mechanics, it is a lot of fun. And one of the things that I think is a great trait about this fight is that you can, if you're an earlier tier player, you're going to have a little bit harder time because you do have to handle the mechanics. Or if you're a little bit more advanced or able to burst the boss down and do a lot of damage, you may be able to bypass that section entirely. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about this trial is that it actually rewards people for having better units, better equipment, and better gear. And that does happen a lot in trials, but not always. And in this case, it's especially pronounced. Because if you can burst the boss quickly enough, you don't have to deal with the flags mechanics. But if you do have to deal with them, it's also not the end of the world. And as a minor note, I know a lot of people complain about the final turn of the flag's rotation that he does. He will dispel your party, and then he'll do a huge hit on your party, and most of the time everybody dies. But what I love about that is that you can just defend on that turn, and you'll survive. Like, it brings in kind of this inventive element where it's like, okay, well, you have to figure out how you're going to deal with things. And some people are like, well, I'll use Rena, or I'll use Celeste and use Sealing Blade and seal away the dispel, or you can defend, or, it just brings this really creative element to the battlefield, which I really, really like. So that for me is why Alexander is number 5 on this list. It is one of my favorite fights for sure. Now, coming in at number 4, I'm ranking the original Attack of Gilgamesh fight. And the reason is because this was kind of, our first trial experience in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, and it was quite challenging at the time, and it was a simpler time, as people may reminisce and say, and it definitely was. We didn't have any AoE cover tanks, we didn't have any of the crazy buffs or mitigation that we have right now. A lot of people were using Cecil, and his buffs, pale in comparison, for the stuff that we have now. But what makes the fight really interesting is how you can choose to handle the sealing mechanic, and then one of the premier options for this fight was actually Rain. Rain has the ability to seal multiple elements with his, I think it's Magma Blade or Lava Blade or something like that. And that made a free character that everybody has access to one of the best picks for it, which is something that I think is awesome. When you have a character who doesn't see a lot of action, for him to be one of the best picks for a particular trial, I think that's awesome. And additionally, I felt like Gilgamesh's pacing as a trial was really good on release as well, where it did take you a while, like it was a challenge that you kind of had to trench in and kind of slug out, but it wasn't overdrawn. Some trials take ludicrous amounts of time on release, such as Aigion. I know a lot of people had to take a super long time to beat that one when it first came out, but in this case, Gilgamesh balances a lot of excellent things: the sealing mechanics, the duration, the difficulty. Just overall a really, really fun fight, especially when it, segues into other fights down the road. It was a really good introductory fight for a lot of players. So for me, that's why I put Attack of Gilgamesh ranked at number 4. Now the next one, my number 3 pick for trials, my third favorite trial of all time. People may be surprised. It's actually Rumble of Malboro, and I know there are going to be a lot of people who are like, wait, Mars, why isn't that your number 1? And I'll tell you, I think Rumble of Malboro was a good combination of challenging and perhaps too challenging on release. It was really good aspirational content. When it first came out, it was so difficult that the average player really just couldn't handle it, and as units started coming out more and more and we got more tools to handle it, it became more manageable, and I liked how we were kind of able to ease into the fight. And my first clear of this trial was one of the most satisfying trial clears I've ever had in my life. Like, it was awesome. I had one of the most unorthodox teams. I loved building around it. Like, I used a draw attacks Snow, and I used Ace, and I used 2 Rikus, and I used a pair of Veritas of the Light, and that was my original party, and that was how I took it on. And for me, I had never seen anybody else do that before, and it was, I felt like the Rumble of Malboro was a place where you could really be inventive, where you could really find what works best for you, your party, the units and gear that you have, and really just bring it to bear. Now, one of the things that made Rumble of Malboro very finicky, but also at the same time I kind of enjoyed it, was how you had to time killing the small ones combined with killing everything at once. Like, there was a level of finesse required to actually clear the fight. You couldn't just go in and one-shot it. You couldn't just go in and, attack willy-nilly. You really had to have a concerted idea of what was going on. You had to plan for, every 4th turn or every 3rd turn, depending on what phase you were in. You have to plan to kill the small Malboros at the right time. Otherwise, you're met with consequences. And I really like that because I felt like it brought a little bit of an immersive element to it. Initially, it was challenging because for a lot of players, meeting the damage check in order to kill the small ones was quite difficult. But what I really enjoyed about it was that it enabled people to use a lot of different kinds of damage dealers. And speaking of the damage dealers at the time, a lot of people had to use Pod 153 as their chaining ability because I think like Onion Knight and I think Trance Terra was a pretty good option back then. I'm trying to cast my mind back. It's been a long minute since that one came out, but we did not have very many good AoE chaining options, and so it was really fun to bring units like Veritas of the Light out, who was a really great option for that fight at the time. In Pod 153, and then Lunera, and then Tornado Chainers. Like, there were just so many great things that you could bring against this fight, and over time it evolved, to be my personal benchmark for other trials. Like, all right, well, this new unit came out, how strong are they against the Rumble of Malboro? And that's how I would kind of assess how strong they actually were. So overall, I really liked it. I also really like fights where you don't have to attack and magic break the boss. I've actually gotten to the point in the game where I'm like, you know what, this is actually really annoying, because most of the time if you can attack and magic break a boss, they also will attack and magic buff themselves, which means you have to do the whole dispel and rebreak and all this other stuff, and I hate that. That to me is a tedious element in a fight. So to have a fight like Malboro where they're only defense and spirit breakable, I really enjoyed that. So I think the only thing that I would have changed about Rumble of Malboro is perhaps make it not light dark resistant. I feel like elemental resistances are kind of gimmicky. I don't really like them for most trials. I do think it's nice to have elements that are good against particular bosses. Like, I think it's great against Alexander to have water dark susceptibility. I think that's awesome. I would prefer it if bosses were more selective with which elements they were resistant to. A good example of this is Dark Ifrit and Siren. I think they only absorb one element each, which for me, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. You are, the Esper of water and the Esper of fire, so of course you absorb those elements. But when they start adding in additional elemental resistances, I get kind of annoyed. And that was the case with Venomous Vines. That was one of the reasons why that one ultimately didn't make the cut for the spot on number 3. I did consider both of them kind of equally because I feel like Venomous Vines is great. But ultimately, what I hated about Venomous Vines that I didn't have to deal with Rumble of Malboro is that Venomous Vines has like half of the elements in the game resisted, which is extremely frustrating when it comes to trying out different units and different builds against it. So, Rumble of Malboro, number 3, awesome fight, well designed. It came at a good time in the game and really set the standard for, what makes a unit strong, how well can it handle that fight, and for me, one of my all-time favorites. Now, my number 2 most favorite fight may actually surprise people, but it is actually from the Chamber of Arms, and my second favorite fight in the entire game is Tegmine. Now, Tegmine is one of those fights that was surprisingly challenging, and I liked so many things about it. First of all, the sprite was amazing. fighting a casket with a sword in it, and then a big old zombie guy. Like, I felt like the sprite evolution was really, really awesome. In addition to that, you weren't too restricted on which elements you could use. I believe it was water and light were the only two that you could not use. It did have a little bit of a gimmick with the magic and physical resist. If it were a normal Chamber of the Fallen trial, I would be frustrated by that, but I feel like in the Chamber of Arms you can get away with some of those resistance type gimmicks. But in this case with Tegmine, super fun fight, very, very challenging. I felt like it was extremely satisfying to beat because he really dished out the damage. He was the most challenging, and I would still contend probably is still the most challenging Chamber of Arms boss that we had. Overall, it sticks out in my mind as one of my favorite chamber experiences because of, you know, I remember that morning I woke up, I was up very early, and I was like, can I get a video out before I have to go to work, you know? And I had to troubleshoot the boss. I had to try, like, okay, well, I tried this and I died, and I tried this and I died. And it was one of those things where it was very fun to actually try out different strategies and see what you could do to bring down the boss. And once again, timing was very important on this fight. It came out at a good point in the meta where it wasn't completely trivialized by the units that we had available to us. It was very challenging, very fun to do. And to me, it sticks out in my mind as one of the best designed fights, especially because for me, the hallmark of a good trial is a trial that allows you to take different avenues to beat it. So a good example of how not to have multiple avenues to beat a fight would be something like Gilgamesh Reborn. In that fight, when it came out, most people were just running double Sids, and they were just trying to one-shot the boss because dealing with the boss and dealing with the mechanics was just too difficult. And most people kind of gravitated to a single way of dealing with a fight. In Tegmine, it encourages you to use magic tanks as well as physical tanks, breakers, buffers, mages, physical damage dealers. You get to bring your whole arsenal to bear against this fight. And other fights don't really do that. Other fights will do things like magic or physical resistance to kind of marginalize those damage types, or they will make it so that using a physical tank or magical tank is kind of a bad idea. But in the case of Tegmine, because of the Chamber of Arms environment and just the way that the fight was designed, you got a really good blend of both sorts of strategies. So you could essentially handle it exactly how you wanted to. So for my second favorite fight, for me, this was one of the most memorable. It was the most fun when it came out. Stood out to me, and also I just loved that it was a Reaper or an undead enemy. We get those almost never, so to have an opportunity to fight an undead opponent, really enjoyed that. And that's why Tegmine for me is in my number 2 as far as favorite trials of all time. Now, in my opinion, right now the number 1, cast your votes now, is Asura. And Asura is really easy to compare because she came out in a similar timeline as several other 7-star fights, and to me she shines as the most interesting and the most fun trial currently in the game. And there are a number of reasons for that. So first of all, a lot of people compare Asura to Gilgamesh in terms of, you know, they're similarly difficult, they have similar sort of, oh, you need to seal this element sort of mechanics, but I could not disagree more with people who say that they're similar. I think Asura is a far more refined fight, and it's a more player-friendly fight in that you handle mechanics reactively rather than prescriptively. And this is a huge thing for me in a game like this where the game doesn't give you a whole lot of information. And so unless you plan ahead and you already have all your stuff ready to go, you kind of have to play reactively. And Asura is designed around this principle. Now, the practical example of this is that in Gilgamesh, if you were to take, you know, you don't know anything about this fight, you don't have any official information or whatever, you don't know anything about Gilgamesh Reborn, and you just take your best party with your best equipment and your best damage dealers, standard party comp, tank, support, healer, breaker, damage. You know, you go in just like that, you will die in 3 turns or less every single time because you have no idea why you're getting hit by all these different elemental attacks. You have no idea which ones activate when. You have no idea necessarily that attacking with an element seals it and then 20% HP later it does the reverse, where hitting with that element then engages that attack. Like, it is such a frustrating fight from a I just want to play in the game experience. That is a prescriptive approach, meaning that you need to know everything about that fight before you get into it, and you need to be prepared for it. If you don't have somebody built to seal the elements, you are going to have a substantially more difficult time with the trial. And that for me is a huge design flaw. Now, Asura has a similar elemental sealing sort of mechanic, where at the end of her turn, she'll activate different stances, and some of those stances are elemental stances, where it's, you know, fire and ice stance or thunder and water stance. And then if you react by hitting her with one of the elements that she is then resistant to, she will then not hit you with a more powerful ability. So you kind of get to do a reactive approach to the fight instead of a prescriptive or preventative approach, which for me, I think is a fantastic way to handle the mechanics. I think it's an excellent way to build the game, and you don't need to read anything outside of the game. All you have to know is, all right, when she's got her flame stance up, you know, hit her with fire or ice. When she's got her shadowed radiant stance, hit her with dark or light. Super easy. You don't have to necessarily refer to a Wikipedia page or a guide or anything. You just fight the battle with the boss. Like, you are engaged with that fight with Asura and nothing else. Now, some of the other things that I really appreciate about Asura is that I am one of the few people who actually really likes HP locks. A lot of people get really frustrated by them, but I feel like those people who get frustrated by HP locks are the ones who just one-shot everything, which is no fun to me. And that's one of the things I liked in the Chamber of Arms trials, is that, you know, you can't just go in there and big wiener the fight and just blow it up, one turn everything's dead in a single hit. With Asura, you have that hard HP lock at 20%. You have some threshold elements along the way. I think that's awesome. It really forces you to get acquainted with the mechanics of the fight. And, you know, I feel like it's fun to trivialize certain mechanics in the game, but if you trivialize an entire fight by killing it in one turn, that kind of defeats the purpose, in my opinion. So for me, I liked having HP locks on the boss. I also really liked how you were essentially rewarded for having stronger units and gear, in that if you make a mistake, you can recover from it. The stronger your party is, the less likely you are to wipe to a mistake. In Gilgamesh Kai, if you're like, you know, below 80% and you're really in the thick of the fight and you're fighting and you make one error, your party will wipe pretty much every time. Being able to recover a fight is one of the most satisfying things in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. For example, when I recovered from a stream clear of Dark Ifrit and Siren, I had Bosch and nobody else alive. He was the last survivor, and he was able to recover my party entirely. And that, for me, that stands out as an awesome moment in a trial. And with Asura, you get that same sort of sense or satisfaction. If things start to go south, you do have the opportunity to turn it around. But in a fight like Gilgamesh Kai or other fights, you're not able to make that same recovery. So I think, you know, a trial that is demanding and punishing, but also giving you the opportunity to make a recovery or make a power play, like that is an element of an amazing trial, in my opinion. Now, there are a couple of things about Asura that I don't really love. I don't especially love that she can buff herself, you know, semi-irregularly. I hate it when bosses buff themselves and you kind of have to have their attack and magic breaks up. Like, it annoys me a lot to have to dispel the boss and re-break, dispel the boss and re-break. Like, I don't love doing that. So, you know, on Asura, she does that quite a bit, where she'll buff herself and then you have to re-break. I don't really like that. I think it's a really dumb mechanic. I feel like if bosses are going to be doing that, you should have things like, you should have Dispel just work against their buffs and not their debuffs, you know? Like, it's, for me, it's kind of frustrating. But, and the other thing that I have mixed feelings on about Asura is that the first 5 turns are scripted, and she has very high damage mitigation. And some people really hate the 5-turn mitigation because they just want to go into the boss and just start paddling away. They want to chip away at that HP immediately. For me, I don't mind having to wait a little bit. And in this case, Asura's scripted first 5 turns kind of acquaint you with the fight. They kind of show you what's going on, like, hey, if you do this, she's going to Hexa Slash you and you're going to regret it, you know, sort of thing. And I think that it's nice that it gives you the opportunity to kind of get to know the fight before you really get in the thick of it. But I think boss mitigation is kind of, I don't super love it. But other than that, I think Asura is one of the most satisfying fights to go up against, because there's a huge amount of flexibility with the parties you can use. There are no gimmicks that force you into a corner with having to take certain units or strats or compositions. I think it's just great. It allows you to be creative, but it also forces you to play smartly, because if you don't handle the mechanics, you need to be prepared to take a lot of damage, or you need to be prepared to handle the consequences. So that, for me, that's why Asura is the #1 trial right now. For me, it is my personal favorite. I love it very, very much. So that concludes this top 5 list of the best 5 trials in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. Number 5, Alexander 3 stars. Number 4, the original Attack of Gilgamesh. Number 3, the Rumble of Malboro. Number 2, Tagmine in the Chamber of Arms. And then number 1, the warrior goddess Asura herself. So let me know down in the comments below. I want to know what you guys think. What are your favorite trials in Final Fantasy Brave Exvius? And I will see everybody in the next video.